so I don't really know how this is going to work out. So I'm going to do my absolute best to not go all Jerry Springer on anybody, but I've always wanted to do this. And this is just so encouraging to be a part of this particular panel today. Have not had an opportunity to talk prior to our panelists on today, but I'm really going to, I did learn that one thing about moderating is that we're not supposed to have as much to say as our panelists. So I am a preacher by default. So you all are going to have to say, Bishop, you're not talking to yourself. That question is for us, right? But I'm going to do my absolute best. I kind of want to go with the flow because I like when these types of conversations and panels are more organic. So I don't want to throw as much questions out there that talks about what we do as much as I do why we do it and why we have chosen those types of things to do. So our panel today is going to really focus on, I forgot the long theme of it, right? Here, let me pull it up and see so I can make sure. Oh, wait, it's right here. Right? Taking care of our own, respecting and addressing trauma. And I'm going to allow everyone to introduce themselves and what it is that they do, why it is they do it. But I want to focus this particular panel more on the concept of trauma, because I think that as we heard Mr. Kennedy speaking earlier, for those of you who were here to hear him speak earlier, I think that he is correct in saying that we have done a great job as it relates to the last 10 years, really getting people to respect prevention of violence and those types of initiatives that go along with helping communities to prevent violence. I don't think that we have done as good a job. I think we could be on our way, but I don't think that we have done as good a job really talking about things that go along with helping trauma. And I think that to focus in on trauma, you can't really have a conversation about preventing violence if you don't do something about literally talking about and isolating trauma within itself. I'm a movie buff, and I was watching a movie the other day. I waited on purpose to watch it. It's kind of a cult classic, and I was watching the remake, the movie Death Wish. How many of you seen that movie before? You probably saw the Charles Bronson performance. I was watching actually the other day. I saw that one, and I saw the one with Bruce Willis the other day. And although, you think about it first, you see this movie and you just think it's all about vengeance. But really, when you look at it, this is about a guy who is actually servicing his community, servicing victims. He's doing everything he can to be a help to those who are coming in wounded by gunshot. And his own family gets attacked. And what you begin to see is a result, the violence, which comes first, the chicken or the egg. The violence that you begin to see him actually perpetrate is a matter of how he is responding to his own trauma. He feels like the police department, law enforcement is not really there with him. He can't use that as an option. And he begins to hear a narrative that you have to take matters into your own hand if you're going to get any kind of justice for your family, for your wife. And I believe that it's right there. A lot of times we've been arguing, we spent years arguing about, who's the strongest avenger, who's really the one that adds the most to this work. And I think everybody adds an equal basis. But what we're here really today to talk about is how did ideology builds around trauma itself, and what types of things can we do not only to heal or provide healing for trauma as it relates to others, but even directly to ourselves as persons who take on this work of preventing trauma or preventing violence, how we're going to deal with addressing the trauma and respecting the trauma itself. So what we'll do is we'll start off. Everybody can grab a microphone and we'll just play passies if we need to. But I want to start on this side. Introduce yourself, give us your name, and then tell us a little bit about what you do in your community as it relates to being able to provide healing for trauma in this violence prevention work.
Hey, how are you all? All right. I am Tashante McCoy from Stockton, California. I wear two hats. I am the chapter and membership development manager for Alliance for Safety and Justice, but I'm also the founder of an organization called the OWL Movement, which oversees a mentorship for young girls called Junior Owls, and then Stockton Angel Mothers, which provides a service to mothers who have lost children. I would just first want to say thank you for allowing me to come and sit before you amongst all these queens here that I definitely have had the privilege and honor to be connected to. When I was talking to T. Marie in the bathroom, I was like, I don't think they're ready for this jelly. In the words of Beyonce and Destiny's Child, how they put us all on the panel together. But a little bit of what I do in a very small synopsis is create spaces of healing and empowerment for the community by just giving them the tools and really also connecting community members to system leaders in an effort to just blend the work and get the work done. I have a healing through action model. I don't like to do anything that does not include healing in it. I think when we're talking about violence prevention and we're talking about trauma, we leave out the need for healing for the people that we service and for those of us who provide the service with all of the vicarious trauma that we experience. And most of us, if I can say, are wounded healers ourselves. And so just being able to acknowledge that across the board has been something that I have found myself called to do.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm T. Marie King. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm a community organizer, activist, facilitator, and a freelancer. I'm not a freelancer, so you have to pay for my services. I don't mind giving you advice, but pay a sister. But a lot of the work that I do, being from Birmingham and kind of that cradle of the civil rights movement, is dealing with trauma, because it's just a traumatized area, and people have tried to move forward without dealing with what happened that got everybody where we are now. So a lot of my work is around dealing with how we individually see our community, see the people that we work with. So I deal with personal bias, community engagement. I'm big on healing, and I think too often we throw around words like restorative justice and reconciliation. We're not thinking about is that the only way that can take place is if the people that have been harmed feel reconciled or restored. So I think we use some of these words as buzzwords, whether it's to get grants or whatever, without thinking about how the community is actually being affected and if they're feeling restored or reconciled. So I'm big on, I know we heard earlier, we talked about data, and data's good, but I think data misses a lot when context is not there. And so I try to help bring people back to what is that story? What is that trauma that has happened? And are we actually putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone, or are we truly getting to the root of the problem? And understanding that this is a marathon. This work is marathon, not sprint level.
Ooh, yes. Good afternoon. My name is Shatara Murphy. I, too, like my fellow panelists, really honored to be here today to have this time to tell you about some of the things that we're doing in Pittsburgh and learn about what everybody is continuing to do around the nation as it relates to violence prevention and specifically for this panel, trauma. So I am the assistant director of our public safety department, and for the purposes of this panel, I will tell you about one aspect of my job, because we do a lot in public safety. But I work very closely with our police department. And when I came into this role about 3 years ago, one thing that I was very, very, very certain that I wanted to do was make sure that our public safety department was connected with the community. From an outsider looking in, prior to being a part of city government, I would see all of these decisions being made for the community without the community, and I'm a part of that community. So then us as the community, we get upset about the decisions that are made that we are not a part of. And then I realized that there is this gap, that the community doesn't want to reach out to government and government doesn't want to reach out to the community. So I just start getting in everybody's faces and we start having conversations. So also too, another aspect of my job that I like to address is the traumas that our police officers face. in their day-to-day line of work, because I feel like the traumas that they have experienced that continue to go unaddressed only feed into the traumas that we can continue to face in our communities by how our first responders respond, specifically our police officers. So I know that is a lot, but that is some of the things that I do, and making sure that we have access. I feel like there's a lot of empowerment through access. And so we have a lot of returning citizens, ex-offenders. I don't like any of those terms, but who do a lot of great community work but are still afraid of the police because of the traumas that they have faced. And so I'm here to rip the Band-Aids off and say, let's get to it. And so that is the role that I have played in my department and continue to play.
Is it afternoon? Okay. I'll say good morning, because my time zone is just really, I don't know who I am or where I'm at right now. My name is Toni McNeil. I am an elder at Victory and Praise Church in Stockton, California. So I'm a clergy first. They have the nickname of the color in Converse. So when they see me with a bullhorn coming, which I'm going to lead it if it's going to happen, I'm going to have on my collar because of the moral integrity of the thing, and I'm going to have on my Converse because I came from the street. I have a heart and a passion for those that came from the community that I've come from, and the more deeper I delve into this word, the more profound understanding that I have behind some of the reasoning as to things that took place when I was growing up. The trauma that my father went through, that my mother went through, that my brother went through. I can peg it on the timeline of the war against drugs, war against crime, war against. And so as I began to delve into this work, I started seeing a pattern that I fell in and my family fell in, and it just gave me answers. As a community organizer, I'm a community organizer with Faith in the Valley, also in the city of Stockton for the San Joaquin Valley. And it's kind of unique. We are, Faith in the Valley is spread out through the entire Central Valley. So we have organizers that are in Stockton or San Joaquin County, in Modesto, in Stanislaus County, in Merced County, in Fresno County, and in Kern County. And I'm outlining that intentionally because there is a line of gun violence reduction, trauma, all of these issues all throughout the Central Valley. And so if you see like a rise, say, in the San Joaquin Valley, and a rise in Kern County, you're going to also see some rises over a period of time in Modesto because of the intersection of all of the issues that we deal with around housing and all that other stuff. When it comes to trauma, I want to say, first of all, as I was listening to all of us on the panel, I believe that this panel in itself is an absolute picture-perfect reflection of what will happen if you invest resources into individuals from a community that have experienced trauma in order to go back into that community and actually make change in the community. Everyone in this panel, everyone sitting at this up here has come from trauma within a community and is going back in because someone told me once, if you want to know the best way to fix the bus route, instead of talking to everybody about that bus route, why don't you talk to the little old lady that's sitting on the bus bench waiting for the bus to come? No one talks to her about how to fix the route. And I promise you, she catches the bus every day and has some ideas. But because we're not talking to her going into the community, we're not hearing those ideas, or we think that we have a better answer. So my job is to kick down walls for people in the community in order to get them in spaces so that their voice can be heard. That's the organizing that I do, to collaborate with those that are already doing the work in trauma, so that if I don't have an answer, I know where to go. I know who to partner with. I know who to call to get mentoring or get guidance or what have you. But to pull those that used to be violent, used to do damage in the community, to reach them and tap into the leadership resources that they had when they were on the street. Because if I could do it on the street, I can do it for the street in a different way. So I'm just developing leaders and helping them organize in the community.
Can I get a round of applause for all? First of all, I know we're going to do it again later, but I think it's so important because I agree with you. I think that this is a picture-perfect example of what it looks like to be concerned to that degree and to offer this type of work. You know, I've been in this work now for years, really. Someone asked about, you know, what was I doing before I started doing it officially for Ceasefire. That's how I got into Ceasefire because, you know, in Detroit, I live in 48205. I grew up in 48205 zip code, and it was established by CNN News about 10 years ago that it was the most dangerous zip code in the country, that per capita we lost more lives through gun violence than had been lost in the war in Iraq. And that was every year. So, you know, of course, you know that there are plays on numbers and stats and those kind of things. But when you live in the neighborhood, it doesn't matter what anybody says. You know what you see, and what you see looks like you are literally surrounded by this type of trauma. And just a few things that I've learned over these years of serving in this capacity, a few things I've learned about trauma. The first is that trauma, it extends itself. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter what occupation you have. I was glad to hear you mention about police officers and the trauma that they experience, right? And just trauma is something that it permeates all of those lines. Also, I've learned that trauma is more internal, right? We can talk about preventing violence, but it's difficult to talk about preventing trauma, because trauma is something that happens on the inside of you, not just seeing someone who may have been shot, but also, you know, the traumatization of not knowing what meal you're going to eat tonight, and, you know, and not knowing if you're going to wake up with employment on tomorrow. All those things can be considered as you talk about trauma. And then finally, I learned about trauma that it's not so much the trauma that actually happens as how we're conditioned or prepared to be able to respond to the trauma that happens to us. And that's more what I kind of want to ask a question today. And I'd like to start with you. And they have here just Toni McNeil. I'm going to call you Elder McNeil because that's just what I feel like respect. Elder Toni, that's good. All right. And I would like to start with you and just ask a question around what lessons have you learned about, you know, trauma as it relates to being able to deal with it or heal it in your particular communities. How you guys think about, or what lessons you've learned specifically about trauma, not preventing violence itself, because I consider violence to be a result of trauma undealt with, right? But just about trauma. So what lessons have you learned in doing this work?
So the way that my mind works, I'm going to try to bullet something so that I don't forget it, but I should have brought a notebook to jot it down. So, Tay, you get to help me. One, with to not forget to say, talking about it. The first thing I want to say is, in our community, communities of color, the majority of the time we don't even know at this point how to identify that we have experienced trauma. The majority of the time at this point in time, in this day and age, and what it is that we're dealing with now, we wouldn't even be able to have put trauma together with what we were feeling because we don't have time to deal with trauma. We have to keep moving. We've got to keep functioning. We are a culture and a people of color in these areas, in these communities that to deal with high volumes of trauma don't have the luxury to stop and take a deep breath and say, oh, I'm traumatized, that hurt me. So we walk around housing enormous amounts of trauma within our being, within our body, within our minds. Our children are traumatized. You see it in their GPAs, in their grade point averages. You see it in the test scores. You see it in their behavior and their inability to actually sit still and function in the classroom. Trauma is when you don't know how to actually problem solve when you have a conflict. Trauma is when all you can think to do instantly is to fight, be violent. Trauma is erupting out of the pores of our community because trauma isn't something that we've had the luxury to actually tap into. So there's resources that in most cases we don't even have access to. And in the family, if you take a family whose son was even associated with or deemed to be associated with gang violence, and he is in a car and there is a shooting that takes place and he's traumatized by that, there are services that the average individual would get he has no access to. So trauma is something we just don't deal with. The church doesn't know how to deal with trauma. I'm just being real with you, because that's what we get to do today, right? The church hasn't been trained to deal with trauma. We've been trained to cope with it. We've been trained to push it under the rug and put faith on it or do whatever we have, pray it away. But we haven't been conditioned and trained to actually deal with it. And the first thing that I've seen in organizing in the community that's been effective is just starting a conversation. Let's just talk about it. Let's talk about it. Let's name it. Let's look at what it is. And then find resources that are there for healing, as few and rare and thin as they are, which is why you have to have collaboration. You've got to have places like Survivor Speaks and Californians for Safety and Justice. You've got to have resources like that and chapters in the community in order to collaborate and work together so that our communities can find the help that they need. Because we are traumatized. I'm traumatized sitting right here. Traumatized. And you're not traumatizing me. I'm just letting you know I'm housing trauma. And now I can identify it.
We, I'm going to speak, we as African Americans are a nosy bunch of people. I know in my family we have been taught to ask about everybody's business and what's going on, why, and who, and how. But one thing that we don't do is we don't check on each other enough. And so when I talk to our police officers as well as community members, I'm always saying just ask how the person is. Through that basic conversation and repeating that conversation, you will find changes in their norms, and it may be associated to some type of trauma. It can be very subtle. When I talk about students, is that kid waking up at night, same time every night, can't sleep but don't know why? There may be something trauma-related that child is going through. You mom, you dad, you don't want to have dinner with your family every night when you used to for the last 3 years. Now you're not interested in having dinner anymore. People like to make excuses and say, oh, well, they're just busy. The work schedule has changed. All of these things. We put a lot of excuses on trauma because we don't know how to identify it. We don't know what it is. But I encourage everyone, law enforcement down to community members, check on the person next to you. Check on your students when I talk to my friends that are teachers. Check on your fellow officer when I talk to law enforcement. Check on your neighbor when I talk to community members, because when major things happen, there's usually some type of trauma associated with it. It's something that we can't escape. We had a lot of unfortunate incidents that happened in the city. I did not realize that I was experiencing trauma until I talked to, so I got funding to hire a social worker on staff for public safety, because we tend to, SWAT calls, for example, go in and we will tear the house up and then we get who we want and then we leave. But then there's babies who have to go to school. There's elders who don't have prescriptions. There's, bus tickets lost. Now they can't get on the bus. There are lots of things that happen that I identified. And so with speaking to the department and having a supportive boss, we were able to get a social worker on staff. So I've kind of aligned myself with her just to listen to her conversations and what types of things she's asking people and what type of resources she's providing, so that when I'm out dealing with the community and say, hey, this such and such resources over here, make sure you tell your neighbor. I'm always telling people to inform the next person of the things that they know so that we can educate ourselves, because trauma comes in the strangest ways. But I promise you, if you just continue to check on whomever, you will identify subtle things that will help you understand that that person might be experiencing trauma and encourage them to go talk to someone.
All right, so I punched a kid once. All right. And it wasn't to be mean to this kid. But I used to work with a group of students, and when I ran a resource center, I used to always say, don't just walk up behind me. And I'm having a conversation with somebody. I'm being real serious because there was something serious going on in the community. And this kid, 15, being funny, walked up on me, and I felt him coming, and I turned around, and I just socked him. And he was like, Ms. King. And I was like, look, I told you don't walk up behind me. You know, trauma, you know. And it's funny, it is, you know, it wasn't funny to him. But
I'm sure it wasn't.
He learned his lesson, though. He learned his lesson. But it was a thing of the things I had experienced growing up. You know, in the 9th grade, I witnessed my classmate get shot in the head because she wouldn't give a 21-year-old her phone number. And we received no counseling. It was, okay, business as usual, go back to school. Nobody ever brought it back up. And so we wipe these things under the rug. We do. And we tough, we survivors. So we just keep pushing through. And then that mentality gets passed down generationally, that we just move on. And so what do you have? And you have a demographic of people who don't even access therapy or even see the value of going to counseling and talking those things through. And then what happens? Oh, we have mental health issues on the rise that come from somewhere. When we talk about lessons learned, I think we have to remember, one, that you are only an expert on you. We have a tendency to work with people, provide programming or services, and we try to tell them about how they're experiencing life and what they're going through, and you have no idea of the living situation, their environment, their community, or their home life. So you're only an expert on you. Allow people to share their truth, and you accept it, whether you understand it, whether you agree with it, or whether you have any experience with it. The next thing I would say is that healing from trauma is an ongoing process. You know, we can't throw people in a program or create an initiative, and the grant may be 3 years, but their work on dealing with their trauma may be a lifetime. So you can't assume that just because we put this together and I wrote this awesome curriculum that everybody's going to get it in a year. No, you just may get through building trust the length of that grant. And now you got to write another grant or find you some more money so we can continue the work. So my lessons learned for people would be, you're only an expert on you. Allow people to express and share their truth, and understanding that healing from trauma is a lifetime experience.
Okay, so let's try something. So repeat after me, okay? Your trauma is attached to your trauma. Got that?
Yes.
I go into schools and I say that when we do our healing dialogues amongst women and the ones that we've recently been having between men and women, I say that to them to kind of just impart that in their mind. And so it's like, if you're a cheater, that's your drama. I guarantee you, if we unpack it, it's attached to your trauma and your experiences growing up and what you saw and what you didn't see. If you're in a gang, I guarantee you that drama of being in a gang is attached to the trauma that you experienced as a child and growing up. It's inevitable. It's directly connected. Everything is connected. And so always just being, there's a lot of people walking around who don't even realize that they are trauma stricken. I remember going to my first Survivor Speak conference, and they put up a whole list of traumas. It was almost like the size of this window, because it was on a jumbotron screen. And I know I lost my brother. That was trauma. You know, I've been shot. That was trauma. But then when I started reading all of the other stuff, I was like, oh my God, I need a therapist now. Because, like, I could see myself pretty much in everything, or I knew someone, so that meant it was vicarious trauma that had experienced everything that I seen. And so with the lesson that I learned, the one thing that I learned is a lot of people just don't know that they have trauma. And so that's why it's really important to me. I have something called Trauma Informed Tuesdays with Teacher Tay, because I used to be a teacher, but I retired because them kids was giving me trauma. But I love teaching and I love children, and so I go into schools on Tuesdays, and I teach them about acknowledging community trauma from preschool all the way up to high school. And it never ceases, it never fails. There, from a 5-year-old to a 17-year-old will come up to me and say, I've been through that too. I didn't even know what the word trauma meant. And so for me, as as service providers, as the superhero preventers of violence, we have to always remember that we're dealing with individuals on a daily basis who don't even realize that what they're going through and what they're doing is trauma, and that is not normal. It's just a repetitive cycle of trauma that they've been experiencing from birth. So that's my 2 cents.
You know, you joined Director Jones here, from Detroit. She always talks about, she was in education too in Detroit. She talks about the traumatization that she experienced as a teacher from the children. And so we get that a whole lot. So I hear that a whole lot. You know, as I think about it, I think that is one of the reasons why the best people to really be able to address it are people who have perhaps been traumatized themselves. Because I believe that the solutions that are going, it's easy, let me say it this way, it's easy to really talk about cutting down violence because you can put that to numbers, you can put that to the manifestation, but because trauma happens so inwardly, you know, it's often hard if you can't even identify your own trauma necessarily, then how can I have faith in a system that somebody else can identify as trauma? And so we put a lot of money into the workings of preventing violence. And then we wonder, why is it that we continue coming back seeing more and more and more of it? Because somewhere along the line, we're missing, what do we do about the actual trauma? And I believe that getting in there, the course of it, every trauma has something to do with what a person believes in terms of how we're going to respond to it. Because we can't necessarily prevent the trauma, but we can do something about, you know, teaching and preparing the church that this is the way that you can teach a person to be resilient as it relates to dealing with and handling and responding to trauma. Being able to teach the person that you talked about that's sitting at the bus stop, this is how you respond to it. Trauma might happen to all of us, but this is what you need in order to be able to respond to it. I was talking with someone from Every Town Against Gun Violence, I believe is the name of the organization. And I was talking to them about trauma as it relates to our institutions and our agencies that deal with it, and how people who may be victims, you know, are oftentimes taken care of, but victims who may have been a victimizer at one point may not be considered a victim anymore. And so then that latent trauma can also then go on to perpetuate more trauma or cause more violence or cause more harm in that particular situation. What do you think, or what do you do about the victim who may also have been a perpetrator of crime at one point in time? And this specifically came up because we were talking about VOCA funding. And I was letting them know, you know, she was just bragging about VOCA funding and what it does and how it gets in with the victims. And I'm like, yeah, but did you know that if a person has a felony, or if a person is considered to be a felon, that they and their family or persons who, you know, consider, if they're victimized, they cannot be considered for VOCA. And it's a lot of government programs that are around that. And so I just like to hear, you know, I see you're ready to go, Ms. Murphy, you're ready to go. So why don't we start there? And what do you think about that? What can we do about it?
I think those are the best individuals, those who have victimized and have been a victim are the best individuals to lead these conversations. I worked very closely with an individual who she was, I will just say, she served 15 years in prison. It's not my story to tell, so I won't tell her story. But she wreaked a lot of havoc in her community, involved in gangs, setting people up, shooting people, but never killed anyone. And when she came home from prison, well, she also was shot at, and bad things were done to her by a rivalry gang and things like that, and then that spilled into her life in prison and whatnot. So when she came home, she kind of stayed to herself. She was still dealing with that trauma of being in a gang, and are people still looking for me? But she had this drive in her to tell her story, to try to make things better. So then there's that stigma of being a felon, and you can't get any funding to do this work, and you know, people aren't going to support you because of your background, so on and so forth. And I just kept encouraging her. I said, speak your truth and tell your journey. I said, because there's healing through that process. And I worked with her through this. She talked about the things that she did wrong, but she also talked about what she did right. And I say, like, God spared you. Ask him why. And I always would tell her that all the time. I'm like, ask God why he let you live. I said, because for most who live that life, your sentence is you're going to spend the rest of your life in jail or you're going to be dead. You were spared. Ask God why. And through those conversations, she just started doing work, raising money on her own. No 501c3 because, people are like, we're not supporting you. You got a felony. Government, the police that I work with know her very well because they were chasing her and jumping out of cars to get her and all of that stuff. So she's like, I can't work with them. I can't get in her home. I'm like, yes, you can. We're going to work this out. And so, but it was through telling her story and actually reliving her journey, which was painful to her and the people who she affected, because their family members are still there, to actually heal that. But to say, this is what I want to do now. I'm going to therapy. I've learned that I did these things because I experienced this. And I want to save lives. And the impact that she has made locally, like, I can't even put it into words. By saying how she was a victim and she victimized, but she's here to save and she's here to help heal. So I think that having those individuals and finding them and helping them be comfortable with their journey and leading those conversations, they are the best people to work with for this.
And just on the back of that, I mean, you mentioned something, though, how perhaps their views of societal support and views of society in terms of whether or not we can trust this individual. Because once you get that label, once, hey, you're a felon, or whatever terminology, we go through all of this to try to figure out what's the right title to call them. Right? But then after a while, it kind of doesn't matter because the same stigma gets attached to whatever you call them. And so at the end of that statement, what do we do, or how do we see ourselves impacting the work around trauma as it relates to getting everyone to understand, again, that which came first? Is this person committing violence because they've been traumatized, or is this person traumatized because they're committing violence or in acts or scenes of violence? What do you think about that context? Like,
I think once they have been given that stigma, sometimes it doesn't matter what came first, the chicken or the egg, because people are only going to judge them based off of the acts that they have committed. Unfortunately, we're an unforgiving society sometimes, and so it doesn't matter what you went through. All that matters is what you did. And so what I tell community members that I deal with is forgive yourself, because when you forgive yourself, you walk in a different light. That it does not matter that these systems might not support you. It doesn't matter that, your neighbor may still think that you were who you were 15, 20 years ago. Forgive yourself. That is the most empowering thing that you can do, because once you forgive yourself, you stop walking in those labels, you stop walking in that stigma, and you redefine yourself, and you walk with you walk in that new definition and who you are now. And that's what she began to do, and that's when she became unstoppable. There are foundations who are knocking at her door now trying to give her money. Crazy.
So, Miss McCoy, what would you have anything to add to that narrative right there?
Well, part of, that is part of the reason why I got into this lane, I would say. My brother is no longer alive, but just the stigma that was put on the deceased, on someone who is no longer alive but was on parole at the time of his when he passed away. And it was like, there's more to the story than him just being on parole and being a part of a double homicide with him and then someone who was a documented gang member. There's way more to the story to be told. And so really shifting the narrative and a whole culture has been a point of ours and relates to that, because you're absolutely right. VOCA and all that, victim of violent crimes, they didn't call us. They didn't call the other family either, because he was a documented gang member. So you got a documented gang member who's Hispanic and a black male who's on parole that gets killed in the hood, double homicide. That none of we didn't have access to none of that. And so as a result of really just being activated and agitated in a way that is productive, we actually in California were able to take those stories to the Capitol and implement a policy where they're not supposed to ask those questions, whether or not you have been impacted in that way before they offer you services. I think that we live in a society that is very unforgiving, but that's why it's important for us that have the platforms and the ability to bring those voices in and to speak on their behalf and build trust on their behalf. We need to do that because I guarantee you, there are prisons all over this world, and if you sit and spend time with those individuals who are considered to be perpetrators, for lack of a better word, they're going to tell you that they experience trauma, that they're there because of so many unacknowledged traumas that it's not even funny. And how do I know? Because I've done so many listening tours on the streets and on the inside, with youth and adults, and I hear the same thing over and over again. So, yeah.
Well, definitely. I saw you grab a microphone, and I want to definitely come to you. We're going to save you for last because you punched the kid, so we know that you we know you got the answer. We already know. So we're going to come to you. I'm saying you last. Elder Toni.
So, I never get the name of this movie right, so I'm going to need help. It's Les Miserables. Say it again.
Les Miserables.
I'm not. Les Mis. Oh, thank you. You are my new best friend. Les Mis. I will remember that. I think of that movie a lot in this work, Les Mis. Anyone not seen that movie? Okay, so then I have more that have. Okay, I encourage you to watch that movie. If you really want to just get a real understanding of how our society works, watch that movie. Because we still operate in the same vein. You still have law and you still have grace walking together, and there is just no forgiving when it comes to law. Law is so unforgiving. It makes no allowance for grace, for restoration, for being put back in society once that brand and that label is put on you. And this man, he was hungry, trying to feed himself and his family. And so he broke the law to feed his family. And the law labeled him a criminal. And for the rest of his days, that's what he was, a criminal. And for the rest of his days, he was hunted as a criminal because the law was dead set upon making sure that he paid the penalty for being the criminal that he was labeled to be because of the guilty thing that he did to feed his family. Everyone, and so I'm saying that because we've got the stats. I don't believe that I'm in a room talking to a group of individuals that don't know the stats, don't know the data, don't know the numbers, don't know the history, don't know the trauma. And one of the things that does frustrate Elder Toni is talking about the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over again, because I'm extremely action-oriented. I have two groups that I work with. One is a team, they call themselves the Concrete Conversation Team. That team consists of 7 individuals, and the time that they have served collectively is 237 years. I got some heads up. Good. So that team is consistent of individuals that have done their time, learned from their mistakes, and are attempting to make a change. They have tapped into resources like Ceasefire. Some of them are from the Leadership Council, and they've gone through the program because they invested in them. They invested time, and they invested training into them. Some of them have gone through Survivor Speak. Some of them have worked with Advanced Peace. The thing is, some of them connected with groups and resources that others would not have. And it wasn't one fit for everyone. That's one group. The other one is the peacemakers. All of these individuals have experienced trauma. The peacemakers haven't done as much time as the concrete team. However, they've all had trauma. And they are the baddest organizers I've ever worked with, most faithful, committed, consistent, and would be in a space every single day doing something to make a change in their community. They want to redirect the youth. They have so many ideas that they're bursting with. The issue is no one will invest in them. I don't want to say no one, that's too broad. I want to say that the majority, when we look at them, all we see is a thug. When we look at them, all we see is a felon. When we look at them, all we see is that criminal, because we look at them through the eyes of the law. What if every time I saw you, all I saw was that thing that you did that nobody knows about? I'm looking dead at you. What if every time you went into a store, they penalized you and labeled you and criminalized you for that little secret thing that don't nobody know about, but if they put it in Times Square, you would be mortified? Well, these felons, they got caught. These individuals, Times Square know their story. But Times Square won't take it down because we haven't told Times Square to do it. The same grace that we deserve and that we would like when we make a mistake, the same grace and forgiveness that we would like, it's the same grace that others should receive. But for some reason, we're afraid to give it to them. Then we need to address our fear, our trauma. Otherwise, we have a system that is designed to keep people in prison, keep them penalized, never, ever restore them, and our families will never be redeemed, our children will never be healed, and then law enforcement and community will continue to traumatize each other.
Wow, amen. You can go now. If you dare follow.
No, but I will take it where she was going, in that we have to be willing to be that voice for those and bring them to the table when they're excluded. You know, I get invited to panels all the time for youth stuff, and I'm like, oh, how many teens you got on the panel? Oh, well, we don't have any teens. Okay, so you won't mind if I bring some with me? And they're like, well, we weren't prepared for that. Well, they coming, because I'm bringing them. And hopefully you'll have pizza for them once we get there, because they probably going to be hungry. You know, but being able to help open those doors, we're getting into certain rooms and we're able to have certain conversations, bring the people in that's being left out. And say, you know what? I know I was here to speak to such and such, but I think so-and-so could do a better job of explaining that. You know, one of the things we were doing with the police officers in Birmingham, we started having listening sessions with the officers. With a greater community. And a Hispanic woman stood up and she was like, y'all never come talk to us. And the chief we had a new chief, and he said, well, I'll come. And she was like, really? He was like, yeah. And I was like, and I'm going to make sure he come. And so that same night, I said, give me a date, chief. I need a date so I can set it up with the community. He gave me a date. We set up the meeting. And Birmingham is about 250,000 people in Birmingham proper. And we found out that 27,000 of that number is Hispanic people. So we get into a room with all of these Hispanic advocates and workers, and what did we realize about the Birmingham Police Department? We found out that, one, we had no bilingual officers. We found out we had nobody bilingual at dispatch. So how are you going to accurately serve 27,000 individuals when nobody can help translate? And then the big thing we found out, well, that the police found out, is that all Hispanic people, and this may be news for somebody in the room, so don't show yourself, all Hispanic people don't speak Spanish. And they were mind blown. It was like little starburst.
That's a mystery song.
It was like, what? So I was like, yeah, we might need to do something about that. You know, and so being able to be that bridge to some of these harder conversations. You know, we had a conversation with the LGBTQ community to say, you know what? Officers are not saying the things they should be saying properly to them. They're being disrespectful. How can we correct that? Being traumatized. And we're not doing our job. You know, we love these titles. I'm an advocate. I'm a program director. I'm an organizer. And you may be doing well, but if you're not bringing those people in the room and helping them advocate for themselves, I don't have a problem being a voice for you until you feel strong enough to be a voice for yourself. But at some point in time, you can't tell your story better than you. But I'll say another issue that I'm dealing with in Birmingham is our churches. You don't get to tap out of the conversation because you don't want to get dirty. But that's what the church is for. We say the church is a hospital. You come for what you need. You know, and what do you do with a regular hospital? It don't matter what's going on. You could be bleeding, dirty, whatever. You coming up in there to get help. And we say that's what the church is. I don't care what your denomination is, but that's overall what we say the church is. And we don't want those people, whoever those are, messing up our new building that we spent all this money, our new paved parking lot, We don't want them in there, but we're here to help to move the healing process along. So when you wonder why people don't have faith in a system, how can I have faith in a system when the people in my community, I can't even have faith in them? Because we are a reflection of that system.
Wow, that's powerful. Because when you talk about that, I heard so much conversation earlier, and in a lot of conversations that we have along these lines, you hear about the values and how if you're really going to affect change, in this arena of preventing violence or really dealing with trauma, that you got to do something with the values.
Well, can I throw something else in there? I always ask people this in my workshops. We all have our ideal self, and you know who your ideal self is. You probably say, I'm a good person, I'm loving, all that stuff. And then there's your actual self. That's how people actually experience you. And so I always ask people, if your true values walked in the room, would you be ashamed? And if you can't answer that question honestly, or if you have to hide or shy away from it, then you got work to do on yourself. And if you got that level of work to do on yourself, you definitely don't need to be working with other people.
So we're going to change up just a little bit. So I was getting ready to say something, and I'm going to let my true values step in the room. No, but around that conversation, though, you hear a lot about that, right? And then, we deflect or we defer to programs or we defer to institutions. And at the core of this work, I do think that there has to be something said. Now, when I say this, I want it to be clear. I'm not talking about religion. I'm not talking about denomination. I'm not talking about whether we wear collars or women can wear pants in church. I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about pure spirituality, because that's where trauma really rests itself correctly. When you talked about asking that woman about, why did God leave you here? You made it through all of that. Why do you think you survived? You tapped into something spiritual. That's the belief pattern, right? If I walk into this room and I say hello to you and you feel that you believe that there's no threat to my saying hello to you, then you will respond in kind. You will say, hello, how are you? But if I come in and I say, hey, what's going on with you? And you just got out of a fight, or that was something that was said to you and then abuse happened afterwards, you're going to take that and you're going to use that as a trigger to respond to me in terms of defending yourself, this and that or the other. Belief is not something that you can program, right? We heard earlier from one of the speakers in the main conference that, legislating love, how do you deal with legislating love? Peace, right? How you deal with these are all spiritual, not programmatic, right? They're all spiritual type, soulistic type concepts, right? And I think that being able to really talk about how we utilize those in order to deal with this root thing of trauma and helping people to identify it, respond to it in a proper manner, because across the board, we all have that common, you talk about, the 60s before or the 50s before, when probably African Americans, the American Negro, we even call them, even though we had less, we seemed to be a closer knit people, right? Because there was a common theme in belief, a common theme in what it took to be peaceable, right? And we don't see that as much anymore. And so along with that concept, and I realized I just took like a 2-minute moderator privilege, and I'm going to give that back. But just around that concept, which is why I'm glad to see works like this. I'm glad to see things like this because we get to talk about it. And I want to really address that more, not necessarily from a programmatic. I think that the reason it's been working is because beyond the program, we're doing work. Beyond the getting a person a license or beyond getting a person something to eat at night, there is that core basic relationship where I'm just simply asking you, how are you doing? What's going on with you? What's happening with you? And setting up those dialogues. So, it moves me kind of into my next question. And we talked earlier a little bit about how maybe the best person to really be able to do that is a person who has experienced and identified their own particular trauma. And so with that being the case, I'm sure that question you asked the young woman was born out of that. You asked yourself after your own trauma, like, wow, God, why didn't that go as badly as it could have gone? Why am I still here? And you use that as a decision-making platform to go and do the work. What do you all think in terms of your own particular dealing with trauma, what you've learned from that, and how you utilize your own lessons from dealing with your own trauma and being able to help others to deal with their particular trauma? And I will start with you on that one, Ms. King. Yeah, I'm going to start with you.
You tell people you punched a kid and they just use it against you. I would say I utilize it in my work because I'm very honest about my story. And so especially working with young people, I'm very honest about, I grew up single parent home, alcoholic father who didn't do anything for us, in a neighborhood that had its challenges. I probably went to a funeral every year between 6th and 12th grade, just in school. I've lost a lot of friends. I still live in the community now that I grew up in. It still has challenges that it's dealing with. So I'm very honest about, we're not that far apart. I made different choices, and I can help you make different choices. So now you see somebody coming from the same space that you came from that's doing it different. I didn't run away and say, okay, I'm going to go live on this part of town. Even though I can do that, and I'm well within my rights to do that. But it's kind of hard for me to live in Birmingham. We call it over the mountain. That was the space that we had white flight in the 60s and other communities were built. I had the option to do that, but when I still have family members living in that community, and I'm an activist and organizer, what do I look like running to live somewhere else when my own family is still steeped in certain things? And so I try to utilize my story and be very honest about what I've experienced growing up, what I've seen, and how it makes me feel. But I don't have a problem getting in your dirt with you and helping you rise up. So I'm an advocate for sharing my story, and they may say, oh, well, you look like you did this or did that. And I'll be like, nope, attended 7 different schools between kindergarten and 12th grade, and it's like, whoa. Friends have been killed. It's like, wow, you've experienced that too? Absolutely. And so being honest about, we aren't that far apart in what we have been through or what you've gone through and I've been through. But it's almost that thing of, you hear that story of the man falls down in a hole and somebody walks by and it's like, hey, I need help getting out. And he throws some money down there. Well, I can't do anything with this money. I'm still stuck in this hole. And we do that with programs. We throw resources at people. Just get this. Just go here. Go get your GED. Everything will be better. That's what we do to people. And then somebody else comes by and he's like, hey, I'm in this hole. And, oh, well, here's a ladder, but the ladder doesn't fully reach back up to the top. So we connect you with opportunities, or we give you something. We give you a car or something, not knowing all the other issues that are surrounded with you now having this new thing, opportunity, or whatever. And then I try to be that person that can come by and they say, well, I'm in this hole, can you help me out? And I'm willing to jump in the hole with you. And the person is like, what are you doing here? Now we both in the hole. But what they don't know is, and what you have to share with people is, I know the way out. So I have no problem getting down in here with you because I know how to show you the way out. And that's what I try to do in my work.
So for me, for one thing, I don't like to do anything that I don't feel is not my lane. So if I'm doing something, it's because I've experienced it. When I look at OWL, the organization that I started, my identity is tied into it. I'm an angel mother. I had a full-term stillborn. I have 4 daughters. Well, technically 5, but I have 4 daughters on earth. So my mentorship program is built directly out of what I know that I'm sowing into my kids, who all have straight A's, and are well-behaved, classy, modest young girls in this society that we live in today. And then with the OWL movement, I know that's more, with the women's empowerment stuff, it's more about creating a space that's fun and that's, innovative and exciting and different, because as women, it's hard. Like, it's a lot. It's hard for men too, but
Why she look at me like that? Like, yeah, it's hard for you guys too. Whatever.
But so all of that comes out of my trauma. I've had adverse childhood experiences. Like I said, I lost a child, and I've also just been, when it comes to like the advocacy on behalf of survivors, like literally standing over my brother in our neighborhood in his deceased state. Like, that was one of the most tragic experiences that I ever had. And so when I go into those spaces, I have a step up, step back policy anyways. A lot of times I don't have to be the person speaking, or I don't have to say anything. I'll literally just sit there, because I've learned that in that way. I've learned more that way. It's like wisdom. It's like gaining wisdom by being able to do that. But just for me, a lot of the Angel Moms stuff that we do, I'm very guarded about it, because it's a very sensitive space. And a lot of times people don't understand that. They want to know, or they want to be, and it's like, it's sensitive. And how do I know? Because I watched my mama go through it as losing her son to a homicide, and then I know how I felt having to bury an infant child. So for me, my mom texted me today. She was like, you have a track record of turning lemons into lemonade and turning pain into power. Like we can literally give an account of all the things that you've done in that way in your own city, and I'm proud of you. And she was saying, it amazes me how you're able to keep doing that. And I told her, Mama, it's because I stay in my lane. It's because I'm not afraid to say I can't do that, or not show up somewhere where I don't feel that I have value there. And for me, that's how I deal with my trauma, not adding extra stuff on top of it, and taking breaks and being honest about, the need to take care of yourself. Like, that's my new thing, like self-care, because I think that a lot of times as service providers, as advocates, our trauma comes up because we're not taking care of ourselves. We're not taking breaks, and we're not acknowledging that this is triggering me too. Some stuff triggers me. When I get those calls of a homicide, it takes me right back to October 22nd, 2012, approximately 12:18 a.m. in the morning, in the rain, in the Filbert Arms projects, or low housing income. And so we've had 23. So 23 times within 2019, I went back to that very day. And sometimes I just unplug myself and like, girls, y'all can handle that. And that's, to me, how I've figured out how to manage my trauma, staying in my lane and taking breaks, and being okay to step back and let, them go forth.
So for me, we call our family prison to PhD. It's a joke that we have, but it's true. We have people incarcerated, and we have those that are doctors in our family. We have the full spectrum. And so in doing this work, I have had the police come to my house. I've had family members of mine who have been involved in gangs, and so I've witnessed gang violence. I've witnessed non-gang violence. I've witnessed domestic violence, you name it. And I, as an adult, found it very important, in order for my healing to deal with my trauma that never showed up in my childhood, showed up in my adulthood, that I go to therapy. But with that, I have been able to talk to our police officers about things that trigger individuals who live in communities that are violence-driven. And so when speaking with our department and having these sessions with our police officers and saying, when you go to this house and you respond in this manner, this is the reaction you're going to get if you do this. But then also, too, talking to community members and explaining to them, if you get an understanding of how this response is going to go, it may not trigger something in you, or it may not cause trauma. Now, every situation is different. I honestly do not have the cure-all. But I think I have a unique position in my department, experiencing all of the things that I've experienced, and being able to take that back to my department and say, hey, this is me. You guys know me. I'm a safe person for them. Because, our officers experience trauma too, responding to certain neighborhoods where tragic events have happened, or one of their fellow officers got shot in this area. Now they have to respond to that. That's triggering. That's trauma to them too, so they deal with it as well. And so being able to have those conversations on both sides, and that also helps me deal with some of the traumas that I've experienced, understanding that through these conversations, I'm providing healing internally within my department and helping to ensure that we have resources and trainings and understanding so that our officers can deal with the traumas they're experiencing, but then also on the community side to say, hey, one, I have been traumatized as a police officer by police. I work with them. These are the things that I've expressed, and then also facilitating a space where I can have officers come with community members to talk about both of their traumas, because that's a tough conversation, but it's one once it started happening and it just took off, and then identifying that, man, we're a lot alike than what we thought. But yeah, so it's in my spirit, and we talked about spirit earlier, and I think that's what continues to allow me to do this work. I do unplug. A lot of people wouldn't think that I have the background that I have, given the fact that I do have my MBA. I've obviously gone to grad school, I've traveled, I have 2 beautiful kids, I live a pretty nice life, but I've been able to take my experiences and use them for the better. And I just make sure that when I need to take time for myself, I take time for myself, and everybody respects that, because they know that once that time is over, I'm all in, full force, you got me, I'm here, but it is very important that I take care of myself first.
So, one, for me, it's not about me. It's just not about me. The fact that I'm even sitting here today is a flat-out anomaly. And to be frank, I think that the fact that any of us are sitting here on this panel today is an anomaly. It's not the norm. I don't care how hard we work. I don't care what it is that we put. The system was never designed for me to be sitting here. And it's not a system that anyone in this room designed or created. It is the system that it is, that we exist in today. And so I'm aware of that. I lead with as much love as I possibly can, because I feel like love saved my life. That I can't be anything other than who I am. I'm a clergy with a collar and Converse. I feel like grace is what saved my life. And it's a miracle. It's a miracle that I get to be here. It's a miracle that I get to speak. When I grew up in the same house that my brother grew up in, with the same abuse, the same violence, the same rage, the same wrath, the same drugs, the same anger, the same every week. My mom got beat ridiculously bad every week. The same terror, the same fear, the same guns, the same abuse, the same, all of the stuff that was going on in my childhood growing up I probably should be getting all kind of therapy. Shoot, they'd be throwing money my way if I were to sit down. But why I made it here to this panel, and my brother's been in prison all the days of his life, probably 75% of his life he's been in prison. Well, shoot. I don't know. I can't really explain that. I can't say that I paid more attention in school and he didn't. I can't say that because he experienced the same trauma I experienced. And his mind and psyche was not my mind and psyche, so it split in different directions. So when I sit here and I speak, I have to remind myself, this is not about me. It's not about me. It's about every individual that I talked to leading up to the day that I got to be here. Because I had to speak to people that couldn't be here. I had to make some phone calls to some individuals in the community. Hey, I'm going to be going to New York. They invited me. I know, believe it or not, I can't believe it. Well, Toni, we're so excited for you. Yeah, but that's not why I'm calling. I need to hear your voice. I need you to talk to me. I need you to talk to me about the trauma in the community. Because when I walk in that room, I need the strength of everybody in the community that I represent to come into this space with me. Because I am very aware that I get to sit in this chair and you don't. That I get to speak your piece and you won't get to speak it. And so I want to make sure I'm representing them well. That trauma, how do I deal with it? I tap out. I tap out when I need to. I go, I take my time, I rest when I need to. And at the end of the day, what keeps me going is what keeps, I think, everybody that has gone through any trauma going. It's not about me. If we're sitting in this space and we're doing the job, law enforcement, when our gun violence started going up higher and higher, yeah, I sent a prayer to the chief and to all of those that I have relationship with. Why? Because I lead with love and I love them. I have a relationship with them. We sit down at the table, we communicate, we talk. We're trying to build bridges. We're trying to get things done in our community. We're trying to rebuild trust in the community. And how can I love you more than I love you? And this work. Your life can't mean more to me than her life. And vice versa. So it goes back to the labels. It goes back to what it is that we've allowed this society to say, your worth and your worth and your worth. And I refuse to believe that your life is worth more than his. So I would be here doing the same thing for you that I'm doing for all those individuals that served that 237 years combined on the concrete team. For real, I would. And they know it, which is why they're willing to invest and rethink a thing and try something different, try something new. They love the community. They love their children. They love their families. They just haven't had the opportunity to actually be in this space and say it. And they don't know how. Not in a way that they feel like you'd listen.
Can we just give a round of applause again for panelists? I know I've gotten a lot out of myself. I want to wrap this piece up with just on the back of what you're saying. I think to add to everything, being able to tap out, being able to know your lane, all of the things that you've said, I think is also this notion of taking care of our own, which talks about us taking care of each other. My intention when I leave this panel, before I leave New York, is to get all of your numbers and all of your information, because we've got to check on each other. We've got to make sure we're okay as well. And you're talking to someone.
I don't want to monopolize that. We realize that in order for us to stay healthy, in order for us to not get caught up in the democracy, is that the right word, Tay, and all of the other stuff, every week as community organizers, working with trauma, every week we intentionally have a call where it's a check-in. How you doing? You all right? What's going on? And we just put it out there. We work through anything that's difficult. We wrestle through in order to maintain the relationship, in order to stay collaborating together, because we know that if this is broken, that it breaks for too many people in the community we serve.
Right. And I think, again, Mr. Kennedy spoke about that earlier. That's one of the things that's been working, that's been paid more attention to over the years. You know, when I first started this work, who would have ever thought, you know? But then you come into this work and those triggers, and it begins to help you identify your own. You know, I'm a person that, you know, I was robbed at gunpoint. I survived my baby brother being killed. 2 days later, my wife was brutally raped. There's all this trauma going on. But I think at the end of all of that stuff, you make a decision. And all of those decisions, that decision is based on all of the things you value in your life and that kind of thing. And I love what you said, because the only difference between, you know, Charles Bronson, Bruce Willis, and myself in the face of all that trauma was that we made a different decision on how we were going to respond to that kind of trauma that was inflicted on us. Look, I want to leave these last few moments. Those of you, you've been so kind listening to us. We want to open it up for questions for you in our last 10 minutes or so. And we want to do our best. If we get too many questions and we can't answer them all up here on the panel, you can find, look, they hang out, right? Just don't walk up on her. Don't walk up on her from the back. Just don't walk up from behind. Don't call her name. Miss King, call it out. so she knows that you're back there. You don't want to do it. You learn a lesson from that kid. Learn a lesson. Do we have any questions?
The question that I have is, when counseling people suffering from trauma, once a person is able to identify their trauma, then what do you suggest their next step be towards healing?
Anyone want to?
Well, for me, like I said earlier, healing through action is important for me. I was on my way to the airport yesterday, volunteers, because I had a Spanish-speaking community of mothers came to me, and we talked about it, acknowledging their trauma and unpacking everything that they had been through. And then they were sitting there looking at me like, "What's next?" Because that they told me that they don't share their stories. It's a part of their culture. This happened. We just deal with it. And so when they sought me out, and it's been probably 2 years now that I've been working with them, and I was like, "You guys should actually start a group so that you can continue the journey of healing." Because, like Sis said, it's a journey. It's an ongoing journey. We've unpacked it. We've acknowledged it. Now we need to go through the healing process. And so they started a support group for Spanish-speaking mothers who lost children. And they had their very first meeting, which is held at my shop. And it was a big newspaper article that they had about them in Stockton. And I was just like, wow, you know what I mean? That's how I do. I've encouraged people to start shoe drives. There's a shoe drive that goes on every year as a result of acknowledging the trauma of losing her son. To me, it's just meeting people right where they are and doing something that's realistic and really imparting on them that it's a journey. All your life you're gonna have that trauma. But these are the things that we have in play consistently, because a lot of stuff is inconsistent. But putting something consistently in play to help them along their journey of healing.
And I'll add to that, I do a lot of workshops around forgiveness. And once we've dealt with what the scars are, since we have visible and invisible scars, I say now you got to make a decision to let it go. And we can't move forward until you decide that you're going to actually let it go. And then once they decide to let it go, we work through that. But then I have to remind them that you may have to revisit letting it go again. And then you may have to revisit letting it go in 6 months, because something may happen that triggers it and takes you right back to that moment. And you got to make that decision again, that I'm not going to be bound by this, that what happened. I'm going to make action steps to continue to move forward.
And I'll add to that, is part of the training that we do in acknowledging community trauma and building a network of trauma-informed leaders that I wrote. It has trauma triggers. And once you teach people how to recognize their trauma triggers, then you minimize the trauma, because now they know, oh, that's going to trigger me, or that I can manage it because I know now that's a trigger for me.
And I think too, just real quick, I don't think that even identifying trauma, I don't think it's as clean and clear as being able to decide like one next step. Because it's trauma, it awakens so many things at one time. And so, on the one hand, yes, forgiveness is definitely a part of that conversation. But at the same time, we have to let them know that letting it go is not the same as doing nothing, right? And so then action becomes a part. What's the action we get into? Well, I've got to bury my child. All of those things kind of go in there together. So I don't really know if there's a first step, second step, third step. But I do think that there is a way to identify at least 4 or 5 things that are common to what it takes in that atmosphere of trauma that can be done, and making sure that those persons and those resources are available. At least there's something, and then giving them the opportunity to help decide what needs to happen now, here, there, whenever. Next question.
Thank you all so much for your interventions. learning a lot. My name is Sarah Danish, and I'm visiting here from Washington, D.C. 2 different questions, if you will be so kind as to indulge me. The first is about listening tours. I heard that come up a couple of times. So could you describe, this is for anyone who wants to answer, some of the mechanics of those? For example, what prompts you to go on one of your listening tours, and how you staff it, how you resource it, and what do you do with your findings? And then a separate question is, what are your experiences engaging psychologists, a clinical community? I'm sure we can all agree there's a place for specialized support, and there's a lot of room for plenty of lay work. And so how do you navigate the balance between resorting to clinical psychologists or psychiatry work to draw from their expertise as well?
Okay, and I'm going to ask too, because I just saw the time schedule go up, and it's already looking like this will probably end up being the last question because it's 2 of them. But again, please see us afterwards, because we want to definitely continue to talk to those of you who are here.
I'll speak briefly to the last one. Everybody's probably familiar with the Equal Justice Initiative and the monument, the Legacy Museum, and so they have asked people to reclaim their pillars that have the list of names of individuals who have been lynched in various counties. And I'm a part of our group in Jefferson County and Birmingham that's working to retrieve ours. And so in our work, what we have done is been intentional in making sure psychologists and counselors are at every single event we do. It may not necessarily be, this is therapist so-and-so that's here, but they're there. And we also have been trying to create calming spaces so when people are triggered, they can step out of the conversation or the event at any time that they need to, and it's a counselor in there waiting for them.
So for the listening tour portion of it, so that there's 2 parts to this. So speaking from the public safety standpoint, there is that piece of actually going out and speaking with community members and identifying the issues that they may have with public safety, how public safety responds. There's just a lot of things that are discussed in that. From that, I realized there needs a separate listening tour needed to happen, and that was just with community members. And I identify myself as a community member. I'm a civilian. I'm not a police officer, although I work closely with them, because we don't know what we want sometimes. We don't know what our issues are, and we don't know what problems we really want resolved. And so it's very important that the listening tour happens with community members, community leaders, separate from local government. I'm an exception because I still identify as a community member, even though I work for local government, and really identifying what it is that you want from your local government, or what traumas or triggers that you're still experiencing in your community over and over and over again, whether it be based off of violence in the community, how public safety is responding to the community. The rec center was closed, and now, these are things that happen. There's so many things that are discussed in that, but it's very important that both of those things happen, but they take place separately, so that when you do have government coming around and doing those listening tours, the community as a collective have already gotten together to say, this is what we want, and this is what we need you to do.
And from a community organizer perspective, we do listening sessions and then one-to-ones. And so that can be from a group listening session where we're pulling in a large group of individuals around one issue or another. And then we break up into smaller groups, and we always have leaders that are there at every table of that group in order to just kind of scribe and write out. And we have prompts that we're talking about. From that, those leaders then actually invite the other individuals to one-to-ones where they sit down and they do active listening. I encourage you, if you're even considering doing any type of listening tours or listening sessions, that you study and research active listening. That means I'm not talking, you are. I'm not filling in your sentences. I'm actually hearing and ascribing meaning to what it is that you're saying. And so I do some very in-depth training with the leaders that I work with about active listening before they get to go out and do listening sessions with them. And yes, we have to have counselors, therapists, relationships with all of them in any type of event that we have.
one last thing, sorry. It's very important, if you're doing this from a government standpoint, that when you meet with the community, that you identify one or two things that you can actually do. Because it is terrible to get a body of individuals together. You listen actively to the issues, trauma, all the things that they're experiencing, and then you walk away from it. So you identify action items, and then you identify a community member that then is responsible for holding government accountable to make sure that these things get done.
Add a timeline to those action items.
And get it done.
And don't punch people in the stomach. All right, look, Elder Toni McNeil, Miss T. Marie King, Miss Shatara Murphy, Miss Tashante McCoy. Can we give it up for them? Just once more. Also, we want to thank the National Network for Safe Communities, Mr. Kennedy, everybody for having us. Look, I had to watch, that's my friend in the back. She had the time crowd. She was like, yeah, like that. So, I'm trying to make sure that I get to come back. I wanted to make sure I get to come back. Look, we enjoy all of you. Thank you all so very much for being a part of our panel. And let's go out there and continue being great. Thanks.